Progtology 101.
What is progressive music?
Sounds, usually produced by instruments or voices.
Nerd rock.
Developing gradually over a period of time, relating to, or using a more informal, less structured approach.
Geek metal.
That are arranged or played in order to create an effect.
Math rock.
Gratuitous. Mind-numbing. Shredding. It's all off the above. Progtology 101 presents the Progressive 10.
Be dangerous and unpredictable and make a lot of noise.
Chris the Progtologist, Progtology 101, Prog A to Z, or at least that's what you would normally be hearing right now. But today I am incredibly pleased to bring you something very special. I had a chance last week to sit down with Steven Wilson of Porcupine Tree, Blackfield, and all his own solo stuff, Storm Corrosion and whatnot. And the dude gave me like 35, 40 minutes, and I've decided to take it upon myself and turn that into an entire show. So that's what we're going to hear today. We're going to hear Steven Wilson and only Steven Wilson. And we're going to span the most of his career, most of his projects, between, like I said, Porcupine Tree and Steven Wilson. And we're going to hear most of The Raven That Refused to Sing. And we're going to hear a lot of Mr. Steven Wilson talking about his tour, about his bands, about his project, and his thoughts on progressive music. So I'm not going to waste any more time here in the home studio. I will be checking in on occasion from the home studio just to give you updates on where we are. But we're going to count down my favorite 13 Steven Wilson songs. And the first one comes from The Raven That Refused to Sing. It's our number 13 entry. It's The Pin Drop from The Raven That Refused to Sing. It's Progtology 101 Special Edition. Steven Wilson Special. It's just the Progtologist, Progtology 101, upstairs actually, in the quiet of the Fillmore Theater before Steven Wilson brings his The Raven That Refused to Sing tour to San Francisco to enthrall us all. How you doing today, Mr. Steven Wilson?
I'm very good, thank you. Nice to be here.
So how's the tour going so far?
It's going tremendously well, and I'm not the kind of guy that would just say that, even if I didn't mean it, because I'm usually quite cynical about these things. But this has been tremendous. I mean, we've been selling out everywhere. I don't know what happened. I really don't.
All of a sudden, you put out this classic-sounding progressive album, and all of a sudden, people want to come see you, huh?
Well, maybe that's partly it, that this album has got more of a traditional 70s sound to it, and that's what people kind of wanted, I suppose, in a way. Some of them wanted me to do, not everyone, but some of them were waiting for me to make a record like this. But I think also there's a word-of-mouth thing that's gone around since the last tour we did last year. Mm-hmm. I think when I first went out and did a solo tour, I guess a lot of people expected it to be me with an acoustic guitar, you know, running through some Blackfield Porcupine Tree songs, and that would be it. And I think people were surprised that what they actually got was something even bigger than I'd ever done before, in terms of the production, the visuals, and the quality of the musicianship. You know, the guys I have in my band are tremendous, and I think that's kind of got around. The word of mouth's got around. This is a show you need to go and check out. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I think there's a general upsurge in interest in ambitious album-orientated music, it seems to me. Really? Even the last year and 2 years, I've seen even more of a move towards that, young kids particularly getting into that kind of music.
And do you think, maybe I'm going off my own rails here because I have my own agenda, but you just touched on something. So you think that there's more of an interest in more ambitious, progressive type of music at this point? Or, I mean, is that based on what you've seen with the new Opeth and with Storm Corrosion and with your own stuff? Or is that just as a whole across the board?
I think it's a general thing. I mean, I don't even know what progressive is. You know, we talk about progressive, but all the bands that we think of as the quintessential progressive bands were never called progressive until like 20, 30 years ago, you know, when they were way past their point at which they'd... You know, progressive is something we've retrospectively applied to a particular strain of bands that were popular in the early 70s, that they never called themselves, but now we have this kind of idea about what that fits that particular tag, if you like. But I think that in itself is beginning to perhaps develop into a slightly wider definition. I mean, I would claim bands like you know, Flaming Lips have elements of what we think of as progressive or album-orientated, ambitious album-orientated music. Even bands like Wilco, you know, and
absolutely,
these kind of bands, they're not making mainstream pop music. They're making ambitious music, which is focused on the idea of the album as a musical continuum, as a musical journey, rather than a bunch of 10 pop songs. And I think that in itself is something that is coming back, simply because the mainstream music scene is disappearing.
Absolutely.
You know, MTV don't show videos, and even if they did, they wouldn't have any impact because nobody watches it. VH1 ditto, and I think the same with most mainstream radio. You know, popular commercial radio now is not listened to by people who like music. It may be listened to still by a lot of people, but not by people that listen to music. People who listen to music tend to listen to independent shows, webcast shows. They tend to choose their own music. And I think all that kind of lends itself very well to a rebirth in music which is not pandering to the kind of lowest common denominator. Now, whether you call that progressive or whether you think of that as in a more wider terms, I don't know, but I think the bottom line for me is that there is more music in the music world, if I can put it more simply. Yeah.
Progtology 101.
I was just at a festival over the weekend in Pennsylvania. It was a progressive music festival called Rozfest, and I had some very frustrating conversations with people who have, you know, you're saying in a very positive way, the 70s and the album-orientated music, which was considered progressive, yes, and King Crimson and whatnot. But a lot of people see that as a very in a closed-minded way, that is what progressive music is, and that they don't even consider Porcupine Tree or an Opeth or maybe even what you're doing progressive, because it doesn't fit the mold of King Crimson. Now, your new album obviously does, but they don't even consider Porcupine Tree progressive music. Like, how do you feel like as compared to your Porcupine Tree stuff to what you're doing now? Like, are they both progressive? Is one different than the other? Like, how does that fit in your mind?
I don't really care. Sorry. You know, but I think any music scene always attracts its fair degree of snobbery about where you draw the boundary. Now, I know from experience, from talking to my friend Michael from Opeth, that he suffers a similar thing with the metal fans. They are a small minority, but there is a minority that, unless it's what they consider to be classic death metal, it's worthless. Those people, I really question their whole attitude to life. Listen, I think they're a minority, you know. The kind of people who think that the only music that's worth listening to was the music they listened to when they were 15 years old, and they've never been able to embrace anything else beyond that. King Crimson, Genesis, yes, whatever it was. Of course, I'm aware that there are people out there like that, and this record perhaps is the one that panders most to that kind of demographic. But that's a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people. Mm-hmm. If my record was only selling to those people, I'd be lucky to sell 1,000 copies.
Yeah, it's true.
Because I think there's probably less than 1,000 people like that in the world. But, you know, my record sold over 100,000 copies already, which is extraordinary. And what is interesting is that I'm seeing people that listen to that music without those kind of preconceptions. Mm-hmm. because they don't know that music.
Right.
Of course, you and I can listen to that music, and I can say, oh yes, obviously there's a reference point there, and
Sure.
I recognise that reference point. But to a lot of people, they don't have those reference points. A lot of the people that are listening to this music now, they don't have those reference points. The kids listening to Opeth that grew up with death metal aren't aware of Michael's nods to classic progressive music, for
Yep.
want of a better word. And I think that's why things will move forward ultimately. What's very interesting also, I think, is that this idea that sorry, I completely lost my train of thought now.
Okay.
No, I was going to say something that I felt was kind of. Oh yes, what's also important to recognise, I think, is that there is no such thing now as completely modern, unique music. It's almost impossible to make music without referencing the past.
That's true.
Now, I would say that actually, to a lesser degree, that was always true. That even bands, we have this idea now that bands like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin or King Crimson came out of some kind of vacuum and just appeared overnight with a completely unique sound. And of course, that's ludicrous. Led Zeppelin stole a lot of stuff from the Chicago Bluesmen. The Beatles stole a lot of stuff from American rock and roll records. King Crimson also was stealing a lot from the Beatles and the Moody Blues. But now, because time gives this everything a kind of romantic, hazy, golden glow, we think of these bands as utterly extraordinary and utterly unique. And they were, and I don't want to give you the idea that they weren't extraordinary.
Sure.
But at the same time, there was a lot that people could listen to at that time and say, well, you know what, we kind of heard this before 10 years ago. And I think that we forget that sometimes. But we live in a world now, where it's very easy to go on YouTube and the internet and have access to the past in a way that previous generations of musicians never had access to the past.
True.
So I think we're much more aware as musicians and as people who listen to music, we're much more aware of the reference points that are available. And also I think it's almost impossible now to do something that hasn't been done, at least in some way, by somebody before.
Without almost getting ridiculous, right?
Without making some form of music that no one would want to listen to,
Just noise, right?
Yeah, and even noise music.
That's true. There is.
It's been done.
Sonic Youth. Hello.
It's been Merzbow, the Japanese noise music, just pure noise. Anything. From the most extreme Japanese noise to the most minimal kind of ambient music to the most candy floss pop to the most technical, progressive metal. It's all been done. Mm-hmm. It's all been done. So if anyone says to me that my music is, retro, and they can say it in a good way and a negative way, it's true. But it's also true to say that every music now, to a lesser or greater degree, references the past. And it's also true to say that I think a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
They like the fact that there is a door they can walk through. People who listen to my new record, The Raven, of course there are recognisable reference points to the early 70s bands, and that's very deliberate on my part. It's come partly as a consequence of working on some of those records, remixing some of those records. But I also believe that this record could only have been made in this time. There's something about the record that sounds very much of its time.
Absolutely.
And sounds quintessentially like me, like a Stephen Wilson record.
Absolutely.
So at the same time as I'm very clearly referencing the past, as indeed everything pretty much does, I also feel that there's something about the record that is very much of its time. At least I hope that's true.
I can't agree more with you.
Progtology 101.
The Progressive 13.
So at the same time as I'm very clearly referencing the past, as indeed everything pretty much does, I also feel that there's something about the record that is very much of its time. At least I hope that's true.
I can't agree more with you. It definitely is it's definitely not. It's classic in a non-dated way. I mean, that's how I would describe it. It's got a classic feel in a non-dated way.
Well, classic, in a way, you use the word classic, which I think is a good word. Classic, in a way, means, to me, timeless.
Sure.
Almost outside of any kind of temporal consideration. And I think, again, that's something that ironically, time gives it. In 20, 30 years from now, some of the criticisms that I think, and I'm not saying I've had a lot of criticism, but the people who have criticised The Raven have criticised it for being too retro, perhaps too derivative or whatever, referencing the few people. In 20, 30 years, those things will not be relevant anymore. It will simply be, is this record a classic record? Has it stood the test of time, or has it not? And you look. I mean, I look back at. I've been very fortunate to work with people like Robert Fripp and Ian Anderson, and they tell me stories about how those bands were derided, ridiculed, accused of being plagiarists themselves.
Wow.
But you look back at the reviews. You look back at some of the reviews in Rolling Stone of some of the Tal and King Crimson records. Very, very, very mean, and accusing them of being, derivative and all that stuff too. But now, of course, again, 20, 30, 40 years later, we have this different perspective on those records. You kind of think of them as almost being beyond criticism, and I think that's the true test of a classic record.
Well, do you think that part of that might be, like you said, there's a lot of young people that seem to be coming around to your new stuff? Do you think maybe it's the young people that were listening to King Crimson back in the 70s that have now got the power that are going to go, no, this is a timeless record, and that's what it is, and that's what stands the test of time? So if you can grab the young people of your generation, like right now,
right,
then your record is guaranteed to be timeless regardless of what critics say today.
I mean, I already meet people for whom, for example, probably the most common is for people to come up to me and say that in this album I made with Porcupine Tree called In Absentia, that they discovered that when they were 15, and it's their favourite record. And for them, that is the kind of in the court of the Crimson King. They were 15, now they're 25. That record will always be. And I think hopefully maybe some of my other, more recent work will have that status with those, people discovering it now.
Sure.
In 10, 20, 50, 100 years' time.
Wouldn't that be great?
Wouldn't it be great? And I think that's the sign really of a classic record. A record that almost transcends the time it was made in.
Totally agree. Now, back to the tour that you're on now. You said production-wise your shows have been bigger on the solo tours. Like, how do they compare in terms of the size of a Porcupine Tree show, the set, the tour itself, the production that goes into it? Like, how does it compare? Is it bigger, smaller, same size?
It's bigger. I mean, I've done more with the visuals. I've introduced quadraphonic sound at the shows. I have assembled what I believe is one of the best group of musicians working in the world today, and I exclude myself from that, so I'm not being arrogant. Take me out of it. The other 5 guys without me represent, I think, probably one of the best bands out there right now. And that's not to say that Porcupine Tree isn't a very strong group of musicians too, again, taking me out of the equation. Sure. But this band is something else, and together with the visuals and the quadraphonic sound system, I believe it's quite an immersive experience. Even down to thinking about things like the fact that I have no support act. Instead of having a support act, I have visuals and audio. So the moment you walk into the concert hall, you are part of some kind of experience. And at the end of the show, also the band leave the stage. There is something still going to happen after the band leave the stage. So thinking about all those things, thinking about making the whole evening some kind of experience. I keep coming back to that word, but that's what it is for me. And trying to perhaps challenge some of the conventions of a rock and roll show. You go to a rock and roll show, there's a crummy rock disco going on. You go to the bar, there's a band that come on that you never heard of, you're not really interested. They do 40 minutes, there's polite applause, they go, all that stuff. We have to have a support band, we have to have a rock disco. No, why? This is... Once I've got people to buy my tickets, I can take them wherever I want. Do you know what I mean?
I got you. You're mine now.
Well, exactly. I can do it now. You're coming to my show now. What kind of experience can I give you? So that's kind of the way I've approached this, and it's one of the advantages of being a solo artist now is not having to go to other people and say, I've got this idea. What do you think? Nah, we don't really like that idea. Nah, let's not do that. And that's happened to me. Interesting. But that's part of the good thing about being in a band is you compromise and you reach a kind of consensus. But sometimes ideas that I've wanted to pursue, I haven't been able to, and I can now. So the solo tour, in a way, is the most ambitious production I've ever staged. Yeah.
Wow.
Progtology 101.
So has the drum switch happened yet? Is Marco still with you, or have we switched? Weren't you supposed to switch to Chad at some point?
Chad did the first 2 shows of the tour, then he had to go back home because he had some very bad news, personal. But he's joining us again tomorrow. So tonight actually is Marco's last appearance.
Well, that's awesome. I love Marco. I mean, I like Chad too, but I love Marco. Now, does that I mean, I know they're such tremendous musicians, and you're telling me that you work with these. I mean, I know all the musicians you're working with, not personally, but I know of them. Does that concern you ever? Because Marco is such a unique drummer, and Chad is such a unique drummer. Like, does that change anything at all? Like, is there ever a concern in the way that it's going to flow when that happens?
They're both very different. I mean, we've done 2 shows with Chad, and they did change the sound of the band. That's not to say that isn't a good thing, or a bad thing or anything. It's just the way things are. I think one of the interesting things about being a band leader now, as opposed to a part of a band per se, is that every musician that comes into the band potentially changes the whole balance and the whole sound. And part, I think, of the gift of being a good band leader is knowing how to put a band together that kind of does have that chemistry. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of luck involved in that too, but for example, it took me 3 attempts to find a guitar player that I felt was the right guitar player. I was more fortunate with Marco, who was the first drummer I kind of approached, and he was perfect for this. But also about having these musicians available and writing with their musical personalities in mind, rather than just writing in the abstract, which is what I did on the first 2 records.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, the third record I wrote, I suddenly had this sound in my mind that I knew that was a result of these personalities and the way they kind of gelled together and the electricity and the chemistry they had together. That, of course, can be easily changed just by changing one member. But that's kind of what the position I always wanted to be in. My heroes were always people like Miles Davis, Frank Zappa, great band leaders.
Right. More than instrumentalists. There.
Yeah, more kind of band leaders, more conceptualists, more writers. Mm-hmm. They could bring in different musicians, but they would always kind of stamp their own personality on. But they would get the best out of these extraordinary players that were much better than they were. And I'm in that position now. I have musicians in my band that are much better than I am, but I'm the kind of conceptualist and I'm the writer. And I think it's taken me 20 years in my career to feel confident enough to be able to do that, to be able to stand up in front of these guys, these extraordinary musicians, and order them around.
But is that what you always aspired to be? Like, did you aspire to be Frank Zappa? Like, did you look at Zappa and go, I would love to do that someday? And
well, I aspired to be, first and foremost, I aspired to be someone who made records, and I didn't even know what that meant. And later on I learned about, later on when I was a bit older, I learned and understood what things like producing meant and what all these other terms involved. And at that time, I was in bands already, and I was always the one kind of controlling the bands and steering the ship, but I don't think I would have had the confidence to stand up in front of people like Guthrie Govan and Marco Miniman and Adam Holtzman and Nick Beggs and say,
it's crazy.
I can't, because I can't do what they do, but to be able to say, I want you to do this, I want you to do that, no, that's not right, and that does take some confidence. But yes, I mean, people like Miles Davis and Frank Zappa are great role models in that sense, that they weren't necessarily the best musicians in their band, although they were pretty damn good,
right.
But they were quite happy. They had the confidence to have these guys that were way above them even, but they knew that they were the ones still with the ideas, basically.
So now with this album, so you did write all the music yourself, but you said you were writing to this band, like you had this band in mind already, you knew who you wanted, you already had them on board, so you wrote to them more or less, because there are very strong moments in the album that I'm like, oh, that's Guthrie, that's such a Guthrie Govan type of solo or riff or whatever. So you had that in mind from the gate, let alone this classic sound that you wanted to go for as well.
Well, the solos are always them.
Right.
The thing is, when someone like Theo or Guthrie steps up to take a solo, that's their voice you're hearing. That's not my voice.
Gotcha.
I didn't write the solos. Excuse me. But I left a framework in which I knew that there would be, for example, a Fender Rhodes solo or a flute solo or a guitar solo. And then it was just a question of working with them and finding the right... I had an idea of the kind of direction. The thing with someone like Guthrie is I'm constantly asking him, play less notes. Because I mean, Guthrie can shred, and
Yes.
and I don't really like that very much. But I love other stuff he can do when he doesn't shred. So in the studio, I'm kind of saying, I'm kind of guiding him a little.
Progtology 101.
The Progressive 13.
Now, besides the timelessness and the well, maybe it is the timelessness and the classic nature, but is there a message like in your lyrics here? Is there a message in your music here? Like, is there something that you're trying to get out there, or?
Well, I hope so. I mean, the thing is, I think one of the great ironies about making pop music or rock music is that the more selfish you are in the sentiment about what you write, the more people seem to see themselves in it. And I think in some ways it's the duty of the artist, the creative person, to be incredibly selfish about what they do. You should never start thinking about what people expect from you, because the moment you do that, you've become an entertainer. And there is a very distinct line, I think, between entertaining, in other words, giving people what they already want, and being an artist who kind of pursues your own creative muse. And I like to think I'm definitely in the latter camp. But one of the things I've found is that the more you write about your own life, the more people recognize themselves in it, because, of course, ultimately we all have a shared human consciousness. We all have a shared kind of set of human experiences.
Sure.
We all understand the concepts of loss, regret. We all understand the concepts of death, losing someone. Most of us, anyway. We all understand the concepts of being in dysfunctional relationships. We all understand, though, and all of those things are things I write about. So if I write about them from a very personal perspective, as I do, a very selfish perspective, inevitably people are going to say, "Wow, that's kind of." I know what you're talking about there. Whereas if I start writing about fantasy worlds and hobbits and elves and space travel, people don't necessarily connect with those things so well. Do you know what I mean? I think it's one of the reasons why, come back to this word progressive again.
Yep.
I think why so many progressive bands don't have many female fans. It's because I really mean this. It's because the lyrics are irrelevant. They have no relevance. Whereas I write a lot more about relationships and things that I think girls can understand and relate to a lot more. So we have a surprisingly large amount of female fans. And I think that's interesting, and it's one of the reasons why progressive music has always been considered mainly a masculine kind of form of music, because the lyrics are just, there's nothing there a lot of the time. It's about sci-fi and hobbits and fancy. No, really,
and slaying dragons.
Yeah, but it's true, isn't it? And it's the same. It's the same with metal music as well. A lot of it's like that.
It's changed a lot now. It's definitely the more modern prog is definitely it's definitely changed a lot.
The Progressive 13.
So you seem like a pretty humble guy. You keep taking yourself out of these great musicians and removing yourself. But do you feel your place in music and in like the prog scene, and like do you understand like your influence here in the scene and in the genre and in music as a whole?
Well, again, you use the word prog. I don't, prog, progressive music. Okay, listen, I think one thing I understand about myself is that there aren't many musicians like me that have spanned the two generations, as it were. So, I mean, I have connections to the original wave of so-called progressive musicians, although again, I say again, they never called themselves that. No one else did until relatively recently. But I have connections back to some of those bands by virtue of the work I've been doing. And I'm also interested in exploring that kind of idea of the musical journey. And I'm not alone in that, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of people doing it. So I guess what I'm saying is I feel like quite a big fish in a small pond. In a way, I wish there was more people doing what I'm doing, at least professionally. I know there's lots of. I know there's a lot of people out there making progressive rock or those kind of albums inspired by those bands. But they're kind of doing it as a kind of hobby thing and out of love, and they're not necessarily touring. I'm doing this professionally. This is my job. Right. I'm on the road like 6 months of the year. I'm making records the other 6 months of the year. I'm in a very fortunate position to be able to do that and make a living from it. There aren't too many of us. There aren't too many of us.
No, there isn't.
From my generation particularly, there aren't many, you know, and I think that's unfortunate. Again, I think it's symptomatic of the fact this music has been out in the cold for so long.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it will change, you know. Michael, my friend Michael from Opeth, I think is somebody that's also very important in you know, taking this music forward, and I wish there was more of us, you know, but I hope that will change over the next few years.
Me too.
The Progressive 13.
Progtology 101.
So what's next for Steven Wilson after this? How much more of this tour? Is there a Porcupine Tree on the horizon? Anything else? Maybe another Storm Corrosion or anything like that?
I don't know. It's a simple. I mean, this tour pretty much now runs right through to the end of the year because we've got shows booked up till December the 1st.
Wow.
So, and that in a way, that's kind of a symptom of the fact this album is doing so well. I mean, I can't emphasize. You know, it's one of those things. I mean, every album I make, I put as much effort into as every other album I make, and sometimes it's interesting to see how certain albums resonate very well with the fans and other albums don't resonate so well with the fans. It doesn't change my affection for them anymore. You know, I'm very happy with The Raven, I'm very proud of The Raven, but I'm slightly taken aback by how successful it's been.
Yeah.
Because I thought my last album was great too, and I thought the album before that was great, and I thought the Storm Corrosion album was great, but for whatever reason this album just seems to have eclipsed them all, including all the Porcupine Tree albums. It's just eclipsed them all. In sales, it's already pretty much overtaken anything I've ever done.
Wow.
Which is extraordinary.
Yes.
Because, you know, it's hard to take yourself out of a band context where a band has a very strong brand and a very successful and quite well known, and go solo, and I know from experience, you know, from talking to other people that have done that, it's hard to make that leap. But for whatever reason, this album's just gone so well for me, and so I don't know. I'm slightly confused now as to what I should do. You know, I
Success has confused you.
well, because it's always difficult. I've kind of made my career by making not U-turns, but shall we say by not necessarily doing the obvious thing.
Right.
I think people have a very hard time understanding why I would walk away from Porcupine Tree. It doesn't seem odd to me because it's like I did that, let's do something else. But the mentality, and I think it's partly because of you know the way these things usually work, is that if you have a successful brand, you keep on churning out the records until you die.
But that's the entertainer.
It kind of is,
view, right? That would be more the entertainer as opposed to the artist or the band leader that you want to be.
Exactly. Yes, and you know, and that's not to say that I don't think Porcupine Tree could still make another record, or I think it's quite possible. But right now, it's important to me to continue to evolve creatively. I got to the end of the last Porcupine Tree album cycle, The Incident. I really didn't know what to do with the band. I couldn't hear what to do with the band in my head at that moment.
Huh.
So I said, okay, it's time to do something else. And I did. I did Grace for Drowning, the second solo record, and that was very well received. And now we've done this record, which is now already the most successful thing I've ever done. So in a way, I wouldn't say I'm confused, but I'm spoilt in a way you know, I'd love to do another record with Michael. I was so proud of the Storm Corrosion record.
Got nominated for a Grammy? How awesome is that?
Got nominated for a Grammy. You know, not everyone liked it. I think some people were expecting something completely different.
They probably were.
I think we revelled in that fact. We revelled in the fact that we were doing the opposite of what some people expected us to do. But I'm so proud of that record. I know Michael is too. I think it's one of the most beautiful records we've ever made. I'd love to do something else for Michael. Talking about doing another record with No Man. Maybe I'd love to do a movie soundtrack. You know, there's.
Well, that's well within your wheelhouse. That's definite.
I think, in some ways, that's the next logical step for me is to do some kind of movie soundtrack, maybe with the solo band or with the solo project. It's the one kind of unfulfilled ambition I have. A really big unfulfilled ambition I have is to do a really great movie, great script, great director, do the music. I've still got a lot of remixing work coming in all the time now, which is fabulous because I learned so much from doing it, and I get to meet all these people whose music I grew up with too. So I'm really enjoying that, and that continues. So I don't know. I have a lot of possibilities. I'm very spoiled.
Wow. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. They gave us the 5-minute warning, so we should wrap this up. But thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Nice to speak to you.
Have a great tour, man.
Thanks, man.
Progtology 101.
The Progressive 13.
So that's it. It's Chris the Progtology 101. I'm sad that it's over, but it is. Steven Wilson has gone, and he's going to continue to tour throughout the year. You've heard him. He's booked solid throughout the end of the year, and I believe right now he's going to be in South America, Mexico. Then I think he goes to Europe and Asia, and God, he'll be all over the place. And hopefully he'll make another stop here in America before he calls it a day. Some of the things we've learned is that it's unfortunate, but it sounds like Porcupine Tree might be over. A little off-the-record type stuff. I said to Steven after the interview and after I turned the mic off, I said, I understand where you come from with what to do with Porcupine Tree and how you've moved forward. And, you kind of was at a loss for ideas after the incident and touring for such a long time on that album. And I said, but it would really be sad to us fans if, Porcupine Tree never happened again. And his response to it was something that really took me back a little bit. And he said, why? Why would that be sad? And it's interesting to think about, but he explained it further and said, well, Porcupine Tree was a solo project to begin with. And then I got these musicians and it went so well that it wound up just becoming its own band and its own thing. But initially it was a solo project of mine. And I only see what I'm doing now as an extension of that. So Porcupine Tree isn't over, it's just extended. Maybe his working with those guys in particular is over, the Gavin Harrisons and the Colin Edwins and whatnot. And, my personal opinion on that is that, well, that group has a certain sound. And they have a sound that we've become familiar with and a sound that we love. So, I said that to him. And, it reminded me of something Neil Peart said after he came back from his hiatus. And what he said is trying, and as difficult as it was to get his chops back and to get back together and get back up to gig speed for Rush. With all that being said, after the very, very first show in Hartford, Connecticut for the Vapor Trails tour, he said he met with the guys afterwards and he said, it would have been really, really sad if that didn't happen again. And I think we all feel the same way about Porcupine Tree. So I'm hoping for a new Porcupine Tree album in the future, but it might be a few years. So that's all I'm gonna say. That's my take on Porcupine Tree and what I learned from this interview. The other thing I learned from this interview is Steven Wilson is awesome. He's a great guy. He's a great personality. He's awesome for our genre, and we need to support him as we have so far, and our genre's alive and well. From what I saw Thursday night with a packed house at the Fillmore, 150,000 copies or so of The Raven That Refused to Sing being sold, the prog genre is doing very well. So to all you who want to put down the prog genre and say that, it's only about classic prog and yes, and King Crimson and all that, you need to pay more attention to what's going on. Because although you will use this album as evidence to support your argument that classic prog is the way to go, this is not your typical progressive classic prog. This is a little bit different. And the more you listen to it, the more you'll realize that. So with that being said, this is Chris the Progtologist saying keep things progressive. I want to thank Steven Wilson, Kim Estelin, who is his publicist, who is amazing at getting me hooked up with Steven Wilson, his manager Harv, the Fillmore venue, everybody there was awesome. It was just a fantastic experience and it was very cool. I look forward to meeting Guthrie Govan and Marco Miniman when the Aristocrats hopefully come out here for their tour. But until then, thank you to them, and most importantly, thank you to Steven Wilson. So until Saturday, which is tomorrow night, check out my live show, kscu.org, 10 p.m. Pacific time, 1 a.m. Eastern time, and then figure out whatever time it is in your area, if you're in Europe or Africa or Asia or whatever. Then be sure to check out the Progressive 13 on Monday, right here, Prog Palace Radio, 4 p.m. Pacific. 7 p.m. East. Until then, keep it progressive. Progtology 101. Exclusively. Oh, this special was exclusively on ProgtologyRadio.com. See you.